Yeah.
Leave it
Just a
very
quick note,
flexible and stuff. Oh, we need to go.
We're going live, so if everyone could mute for a minute. Wonderful. Well, welcome, everyone. I think we can get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the session. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting this session on ecosystems and to be joined by this wonderful group of practitioners from around the world, bringing their experiences to the table. So a quick point on logistics before we get started. We'll try to keep presentations short so that we can get into a discussion. And with that in mind, please do share any questions that you have in the chat. And if you have questions directed for a particular speaker, please do let us know in that message. So with that, my name is Will Scott Kemetz. I am the manager of Frontiers Lab Asia, coming to you from Bangkok. FLA, Frontiers Lab Asia, is an ecosystem strengthening program backed by the Australian government. So this topic is very near and dear to me. Before we get started, I want to just really quickly offer a definition and revisit the origins of the concept, because I think there are some important concepts that get, important aspects of the concept that get lost. So what is an entrepreneurial ecosystem? Well, unsurprisingly, there are many definitions, but put simply, it's not what enables or inhibits entrepreneurs from growing ventures. This can be and is often reduced to assessments of sort of particular conditions, right? So lack of capital or poor policies, but these assessments negate the complexity, right? The entrepreneurial ecosystem is both a collection of actors, so the individuals, the communities, the organizations and institutions with their respective assets, but also the constantly evolving conditions and dynamics that they generate through their interactions. All of this coalesces to mediate the performance, or what we refer to as generative capacity, of the local entrepreneurial environment. The concept is typically traced back to a series of articles, academic papers and books that started emerging around the early 90s. And the thinking extends back further, and since then many have built on it. But one of the first to use the term was James Moore in this article, A New Ecology of Competition. And what Moore sought to highlight in that was, and this was subsequently reinforced by others, that the dynamics in these systems are constantly evolving, and these systems are defined by kind of interdependency and mutualism. What does that mean? Well, the collapse of a venture makes resources available for others to absorb. The presence of large ventures is stabilizing, and their protection can be really supportive for small and emerging ventures, but it also restricts their growth. Diversity keeps systems healthy and in balance. Feedback loops are crucial. The insight here was that these dynamics reflect those seen in forests. and other natural ecosystems, right? So the question for me coming into this session is, what does that mean for those trying to stimulate, accelerate, and strengthen entrepreneurial ecosystems? And I think we have a wonderful cross-section here in the room today of people in different parts of the world trying to do this. But we are still learning about natural ecosystems as well. Recently published reports show that trees actually share resources through underground fungal networks. I digress. The point that I'm trying to make is that we have to take a systems approach, and focusing on dynamics rather than organizations seems to be, to me at least, the key to ecosystem growth. And I think we'll hear a bit of that in the examples shared today. Each of these practitioners has taken quite a different approach. So as I said, I think we'll get a really nice cross-section. Lastly, recognizing this is an emerging area of practice and an emerging area of funding, we'll try to keep it practical. We will finish with some recommendations for practitioners and for funders. And with that, I think let's make a start. So first up in terms of presentations, Sebastian from previously Startup Chile and now Deep Ecosystems. It'd be wonderful to hear a little bit about the work that you've done, what was achieved, how did it work, who was involved, and why do you think it worked?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a huge pleasure for me just to be here with all of you guys. So thank you for the invitation. And it's as you mentioned before, it's an emerging topic. We have been working, I personally have been working on this in the last 10 years, but now we can start to understand it as a new kind of industry, you know, growing with professionals working into it. So yeah, as you mentioned it, I'm coming from Chile, the end of the world. We started to say recently the beginning of the world, different approach. And that's connected with something that I wanted to tell you that happened back there in Chile. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we never believed that Chileans were capable to do global businesses. Even though we were very innovative, a lot of patents were created, you know, a lot of R&D and stuff like that, but nobody believes that we were able to compete with other countries. Basically because we believe we were the end of the world. And every time that we were talking to an entrepreneur, hey, you have a great product, go to another market. They say that only happens in movies. There's no way that will happen. So we understood that we had a cultural thing in Chile that avoid our companies just to go globally, you know. So when we saw that problem, somebody wonderful started to happen, and it was the creation of Startup Chile. And Startup Chile said, okay, what if we do a crazy experiment? And it was even more crazy because this came from the government. And it's like, let's do a crazy experiment. Let's bring foreigners. Let's mix these foreigners with Chilean and let's see what happens. You know, let's create more network for them. We started to do that with Startup Chile. Started as an entrepreneur program for foreigners. You know, we give them money, equity-free funding. You know, access to markets and stuff like that. But at the beginning, we really focus a lot on the entrepreneurs, on the talent, and that's very connected to what you said at the beginning. Why, when we talk about ecosystems, it's important about dynamics, and it's because what is more dynamics than an entrepreneur? If you focus on the entrepreneurs, and I'm pretty sure that we will go deep on this topic, but if we focus on the entrepreneurs, as we did in Startup Chile and in many other organizations, you will follow a dynamic profile of person that it will tell you where to go all the time. So if you develop public policies focusing on the entrepreneurs and let them play, you will put that dynamic thing into your ecosystem. We will go deeper on that. So yes, Startup Chile was created for that, just to bring foreigners and to mix it with Chileans to see what happens. Great results. We actually have a scientific study from Stanford University that measured the social effect that these foreigners created in Chile. And after 5 years, we had a booming ecosystem with the media covering a startup that never happened before. The universities created Master for Innovations, something that never happened before. Venture funds started to come to Chile, you know, and we put it, the startup thing, the technology thing, as a trend. So more and more started to grow. In a second stage, Startup Chile became an accelerator because we understood that the ecosystem was growing, and we started to think about what the next step. And the next step was, now that the culture is more global, we need to help them to go into those markets. And the best way for us, it was through acceleration programs. And we sophisticate a little bit the program in order to develop services for the companies to grow. At the end, all the things that we did, all those things that I'm telling you, are what we did in order to put the talent at the center. And we Startup Chile was a facilitator from the government. We never decide what to do with entrepreneurs. We never force them to do anything. We just were facilitators, you know. They arrived to Chile. We speed up the visa thing. Instead of waiting for 6 months, it took 2 weeks because we brought box of chocolates to a secretary, you know, that managed the visa thing, just to please asking her to please help us with entrepreneurs to change the country. And we started to create those kind of things, you know. So at the end, it's all about the entrepreneur and put the focus there. And just to end it up, that brought me here to Europe now to try to replicate what we did in Startup Chile with other local and regional ecosystems here. At the end, the key is to put entrepreneurs at the center, and that's what we do today in Deep Ecosystems. We're creating a huge community of ecosystem builders and entrepreneurs, of course, because ecosystem builders are entrepreneurs, and we're helping them to connect and grow their ecosystem. Because at the end, and as I said before, I'm pretty sure we will go deep on this. If you put entrepreneurs at the center of all the things that you're doing, you will put and add that dynamic things that you need on ecosystems.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sebastian. So great to hear about the work. And I think there's a couple of things in there. Definitely the focus on the entrepreneur. I'd love to come back to this. And the facilitation role, like what does it look like to facilitate the growth of an ecosystem as opposed to coming with the notion of ecosystem building? Thanks. I'll keep us moving for the time being, and let's come back. Sean, would love to hear from you. You've taken a really responsive, from what I can see, targeted approach with Property Point in South Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about what was achieved, how it worked, and why you think it worked?
Oh, no, definitely. I think, well, thank you so much, and greetings to everyone else that's listening. So just a bit of an introduction while I pull up just 1 or 2 slides. I'm Sean Tennyson. I'm also the founder of 2 social enterprises, Property Point and Entrepreneurship to the Point. And the aim is really to share a little bit about the work that we've done. So we've taken was probably quite a targeted approach in an industry in South Africa that really experienced quite a bit of transformational challenges. And the aim was really to say, how do we take a more sector-specific approach in terms of building change and impact? But then alongside that, we then started up another social enterprise called Entrepreneurship to the Point in order to take a side view around the impact that we're able to make. So I think building an ecosystem does take a top-down, bottom-up, and a side-by-side approach. Just to share some of the overview around what we do as Property Point, as the name alludes, we work specifically in the property sector. And one of the biggest challenges that we experienced from a South African context was really some of the pain points that exist within the property sector was a lack of transformation, the lack of inclusion of small businesses within private sector supply chains, and effectively taking these businesses and growing these businesses into more substantial businesses. I'm trying to move my slides, but I think it's not moving. So I'm going to stop and just speak to some of the slides. The aim was then to say, let's take a more of a human-centered design approach. You know, what are some of the needs that exist, both for small businesses within the industry, but also on the demand side for big corporates in the supply chain perspective? Because there was a huge disconnect between what supply chains were looking for in terms of the integration of small and growing businesses and what the demand and what the businesses in the market were actually able to deliver. Over the 13 years, we've then built a specific model of engagement, which we call the 3 Rs, which really speaks to risk, reputation, and relationships. I think what we know in the space of small business ecosystem is that small businesses are viewed as high risk. In the South African context, there was also a challenge around some of the transformational elements or diversity and inclusion elements that was going alongside that. And Black businesses, based on the history of South Africa, were excluded from the economy. So what you would find that there was a market perception around Black businesses not being viewed as capable, competent, and able to deliver. So their risk factor, both from a buyer's perspective, as well as from a supply chain perception perspective, was viewed as low. In the reputation box, our aim is then to say, how do we effectively build the reputation of the business? And that really focuses on how do we build competency, capabilities, capacity of these businesses within the ecosystem. And then when we move on to the relationship box, how do we also ensure that small businesses also fits the right culture from a supply chain perspective? Over the 13 years that we've been in existence, our focus has been building market access for these small businesses. We've achieved over 112 million US dollars of market access for small businesses. We've accelerated and incubated over 313 businesses with a medium growth rate of about 35%. And with a key focus on our theory of change to also create and sustain jobs, being able to create almost 3,000 jobs through these businesses, but also have a strong lens on gender bias, with 51% of the businesses that we've worked with being women businesses. And yeah, I think that's just been some of the biggest kind of wins from an impact perspective, but also knowing that in order for us to build the ecosystem, we had to play an active role, whether it's through industry association, Chamber of Commerce, other bodies within the South African context, like Andy, which has a strong representation in South Africa as well, and being able to also say, if we are able to do this within this context, how do we also take this out across the rest of the continent? So that's one of the key focuses that we have at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean. It's really wonderful to hear a little bit about this initiative in your own words. I highly recommend anyone that hasn't come across the Property Point initiative before, please do have a look. It is a really wonderful success story of a really targeted approach to ecosystem building. We've got a couple of questions starting to come in, but I'll keep us moving through the presentations to start with, and then let's get to questions and discussion. So with that, Milos from Swiss EP, it would be wonderful to hear a little bit about the really, I think, bottom-up approach that you've taken to ecosystem strengthening or ecosystem building.
Yeah, well, hi everyone, thank you for being here. Also, thanks for inviting me to participate here. I'm Milos. I'm, as Will said, coming from a Swiss EP program. Swiss EP stands for Swiss Entrepreneurship Program. I'm working for Swiss Contact, which is the organization implementing this program. And we have been working for the last 6 years in 7 different countries in the world, in 3 different continents, in 7 different ecosystems doing different things. In my case, I'm situated in the Balkans, in Serbia, sitting in Belgrade right now. But I'm also implementing the program in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I'm here to talk to you a bit about the bottom-up approach. In our case, when we started, we had no idea where we're going to go. So this is like completely different how it started to where we are now, but we will talk about that a bit later. In our case, what we do is basically, well, luckily we have Sebastian here, so we're actually completely opposite from where he comes from. So we are actually on the receiving end on people like Sebastian, because our main mandate is to bring foreign experts here from more developed ecosystems, which are helping our local partners on their journeys. So in our case, our partners are different kinds of so-called startup organizations. This is a term that we use for different kinds of organizations. In our case, they are usually either accelerators, hubs, co-working spaces, incubators, or any kind of organization that supports entrepreneurship. Throughout the years, we mostly specialized in IT entrepreneurship. We still do some other things related to social entrepreneurship and more traditional ones, but mostly we are focused on IT and startups. In our case, we have 2 main mechanisms of support. As I said, we bring knowledge and we bring experts, but we do it in 2 different ways. One is short term and the other is longer term. And that means like when somebody has a very specific need, they can come to us and ask for our support. And we usually do these kinds of initiatives in a short-term term. When I say short-term, I think like a week or maybe 2 weeks. In longer term, we had a bunch of experts staying for a month or longer and getting more embedded in our ecosystem, sharing their experiences. Obviously, we're in COVID times now, so physical visits are not possible anymore. At least in our case, we haven't had an expert on the ground in the last almost 2 years. So we are completely online now. So we're trying to do everything as we used to, but a little bit in a different environment. To go back on the questions that you asked about what was achieved, how it worked, and why I think it worked. But what I think is our main achievement is that we are actually helping other people either fail or succeed quicker and safer than they would without us. So our main goal is not to make everybody successful and have everything coming out perfectly. In a lot of cases, the end receivers of our activities are entrepreneurs, obviously, but we work with them more indirectly and more directly with the organizations which are working with these startups and companies. So in our case, we are helping them realize their ideas, or in some cases even develop businesses going to succeed or not. And on a level of organizations, we are also helping them learn on other people's mistakes. So in case of, as I mentioned, Sebastian, I'm going to use him as an example. It's very simple because he's here, but he already worked within one of our countries, being North Macedonia. So his experience was super valuable for an organization which is called Startup Macedonia, which is very similar to what Startup Chile is, but Startup Macedonia has a much smaller experience than Chileans, so they can help them with very similar models, obviously in a different context. So why I think it worked is something that I think we will talk a bit later, is that we pride ourselves by being completely bottom-up. Our project doesn't have any contractual obligations with any of our partners, which I think is very, very important here, because I worked for like 10 years or even more on different kinds of projects. And when you have contractual obligations, it kind of slows things down very often, especially if projects are lasting longer than 4 years. In our case, everybody comes to us with concrete needs. So it's completely needs-driven approach. And nobody is forced to work with us. And on the other hand, our only mandate is bringing in knowledge. There is no money involved in this. So if somebody wants to learn something, try something, or go somewhere specific, they come to us. And this is now a very streamlined process. Obviously, it wasn't like this 6 years ago. It took a while for us to get trust in the ecosystem. It's the ecosystem is full of different kind of initiatives, and our positioning was very important. So we pride ourselves on this bottom-up approach, listening to our partners and moving quickly. So we had some initiatives going through in less than a week from the first contact with an expert and then getting them on the ground. So I think for the beginning, that's okay.
That's a wonderful place to start. Thank you. And I think there's a couple of themes in there and patterns emerging, bringing in foreign experts. I'm remiss to frame it that way, but the knowledge sharing across different ecosystems, this idea of bringing in what works in one and then bringing it in a way that it can be contextualized in another, and this needs-driven approach. There's this very much, I think, a pattern across the approaches that you shared, but I think another thing for us to come back to in the discussion. So with that, Leah, you have studied ecosystems around the world in your work at Endeavour. It would be wonderful to hear a little bit from you about what you've learned, and if there are any patterns that connect to what Sean, Milos, or Sebastian have shared. It would also be wonderful to hear you try to tease those out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Will. And thanks everyone for sharing your program so far. As a researcher, it's very exciting for me to identify those patterns as well. So I look forward to the discussion. I'm Leah Bartow. I lead a research team at Endeavour. Endeavour is a global organization that supports high impact entrepreneurship in more than 40 markets. And we focus on founders that have the highest potential to scale their companies, and to those that are helping to build the local ecosystems and really giving back. So our research specializes in actually understanding the needs of high impact entrepreneurs and evaluating those networks to understand the dynamics that help enable scale or help facilitate the founders in paying it forward to the next generation of entrepreneurs. And I think what I'm hearing today is that it would be most valuable to look at some of our findings around ecosystem building, of sort of what does success look like? What does a really robust ecosystem look like? And what are those behaviors that we see there? And then more importantly, what can be put in place at earlier stages? So as those ecosystems are growing, what kinds of things can facilitators like support organizations be mindful of at the earliest stages of growth? So I'd like to touch on a couple points. So in our work, we obviously encourage people to use evidence. So I would really echo what Sebastian already said, and especially what everyone has shared about following the lead of founders. We do see it as a best practice to help decision makers understand the entrepreneurial strengths that may already be present in an ecosystem, rather than entirely trying to bring outside resources in. Because there may already be sparks of entrepreneurial activity that can just be built upon. So I think assessing the right industries and sectors that are emerging, the talent and capabilities that are already in place. And then secondly, listening to the founders who have already reached scale, because those are some of the most knowledgeable people in the ecosystem. They've navigated those hurdles, and the challenges that they're facing now are more indicative of the true constraints that are really happening in the ecosystem. So rather than following the needs of those that may have variability based on their business model or just their skill set level, by listening to the cohort of founders that have already grown their companies, can actually inform policies and programs that would help most of the companies going forward. What I'd like to share today is findings from two of our reports, very briefly, that focus on this other principle around encouraging founder reinvestment. Because I think this is extremely important, that once success does happen in an ecosystem, that that value and wealth is reinvested. And there's a few things that can be in place as ecosystems grow. So this is, I'll start with a presentation of just one slide from our study of Silicon Valley, because it's the kind of the most common ecosystem that people can think of in terms of success. But very few people realize that there were some very interesting dynamics that happened early on in the mid 1950s, at a time where other ecosystems were growing. So cities like Boston and New York had thriving computer chip industries, and the Bay Area was, an agricultural area. There wasn't a lot of investment already happening there. So this just goes to show that great companies can develop in unlikely and challenging places, and that just a handful of entrepreneurs can make a really big impact. So let's take a look at that. So there was a company called Fairchild Semiconductor that had 8 founders. And when they grew and had 2 people helping them access some really big customers and were able to grow their company very rapidly, when that success happened, those 8 founders spun out different companies and that stayed in the same area. And in just 12 years, there were more than 31 spinouts from just that single company. And there's a couple elements at play. So there was ambition to grow large companies, first off. So it wasn't just about creating a company that they could just have their own flexibility. They really wanted to grow these companies to become large. And then the reinvestment focus. So this was an environment where employees could take their experience and had the freedom to start their own company, and there weren't constraints around competitiveness at the time. And they were really inspired. And the former, there was a camaraderie to help one another. And so when those 8 people went out to start new firms, they also encouraged their employees to start firms. And so that sort of passing it on in terms of mentorship, and then even later on investment and angel investment from those experienced founders was really, really important. So that's an example from Silicon Valley, and you can learn more by reading our report called How Silicon Valley Became Silicon Valley. The other example I'll share is from Istanbul. This is a very robust ecosystem. We looked at the tech sector in Istanbul, Turkey, a few years ago, and did one of our social network analysis. So this is a visualization of the network of entrepreneurs. So each bubble represents an entrepreneurial company, and the size of the bubble reflects how many connections they have with other founders. So the biggest bubbles are those that are the most well-connected. And their placement on the map, according to those light gray concentric rings, shows when the company was founded. So those that were founded longer ago are towards the middle, and those at the outer edges are founded more recently. And the different color arrows correspond to the types of connections between those companies. Things like former employment, mentorship, and angel investment, and even serial entrepreneurship for founders that have gone on to found multiple companies. And what we learned by doing this study was that the companies that grew to become large were much more likely to have received mentorship or investment or some type of support from other founders who had scaled their companies. So that just means that some of the most valuable assets in an ecosystem that can help future generations grow are those successful founders, because they've navigated the challenges themselves. And oftentimes we found in our studies is that those successful mentors are actually underutilized. They have the capacity to be mentoring more people and be in positions of influence and leadership more often than they actually are. So too often the nodes of influence that we see in other maps are ecosystem actors like accelerators and investment firms that can have a large amount of influence, but maybe passing on information from less experienced entrepreneurs. And so we want to encourage that sort of founder first efforts where the most successful founders are taking the lead.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leah. So there's a lot in what's just been shared. I think we've managed to squeeze an enormous amount into a very short space of time. So thank you, the four of you, for trying to work with my ambitious timeline. I'm excited to get into questions. There's a few things bubbling up for me. I'd love to hear what's bubbling up for the four of you, but we have one in particular from the audience that I want to pull out first. So this one's for you, Sebastian, from Marcus. What do you mean by mixing foreigners in the local entrepreneurial ecosystem? Were you mainly targeting diaspora? How did this work exactly? And why were you targeting foreigners in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So as I said at the beginning, the main problem that we intended to target in Chile when we created a startup Chile was to foster the culture, right? To push the local culture and to tell the people that was creating companies that it is possible to grow globally, but they didn't believe that. So we took obviously an approach based on the context, and the context was this economical crisis led by the US subprime, the Europe entering recession. Everybody was kind of closing frontiers, and we did completely the opposite. We said, what if we bring talent to Chile to see how can we use that talent, mix it with Chileans, other startup founders, and prove the Chileans that it is possible to do businesses in all over the world from Chile. So what if we bring those kind of founders that are in Silicon Valley right now for 6 months to Chile, and let's see what happens when they interact. So of course that interaction was through a formal program. Chileans could apply, but also foreigners to these accelerators, and we started to mix them through the whole process. And then when you sit down in a table, a guy from Germany, from the US, from China, and from Africa, and you put a Chilean there, that's when the magic starts to happen. The Chileans start to realize that the guy that is sitting in front of him is just raising capital from a computer, from a Skype call. The Chileans say, look, I also know how to use Skype. Of course. Then he see the next guy sitting right next to him just selling into a guy in the other side of the world. I can do that too, you know, and I can keep going with many examples, but that's kind of the feeling that we want to try to create there is when you travel to other countries. It's kind of open-minded thing, you know. We measured that. Actually, Stanford University went to Chile. They measured that, and they saw that Chilean startups, after they went through the program, they started to expand their networks. They started to identify in a better way problems to solve. We all know that if you don't know what's the problem that you're solving, you're basing all in a product, and that's basically the death of your company. So Chileans started to think in terms of the business differently, thanks to all these foreign entrepreneurs. So our approach was using the global context, because many talent was wasted from the biggest economies because of the visa problem and stuff like that. And we said and asked ourselves, what if we bring that talent into Chile and let's see what happens? Awesome results. Chile is now on the map. You know, we created the ecosystem. It's the best ecosystem in Latin America. And I keep talking about results, but that's the main answer to the question, why foreigners? To create that mixed thing and to open the mind to Chileans.
That's great. And I'd love to get your take on this, Milos. Obviously, this is really core to the Swiss EP model. And I'm thinking more broadly, like, how can those trying to strengthen ecosystems around the world learn from each other? And how can really effective methods be replicated?
I was listening to Sebastian talking, I'm like, should I raise a hand or should I just go for other questions? So thank you for picking me up. So I completely agree with Sebastian. This is something that we learned throughout the years. So foreigners, obviously, it's not because they're foreigners, it's just that they are coming from different ecosystems which are went further. So in our case, it could be somebody from Bulgaria, which is much closer to us, but it also can be somebody from Silicon Valley or from Canada or any other more developed ecosystem, Tel Aviv, London, or whatever. And what we've seen, I'll give you a little bit of background, which unfortunately probably already know. I mean, we're coming from our country used to be bigger, used to be a communist country. There was a horrible war in the 90s. Things fell apart, crisis, recession, economic issues and everything. And people were coming out to this. I mean, obviously it was 30 years, 25 years ago, so it's not that recent, but it's still pretty recent. And you're trying to explain somebody that they can go to global market, and that doesn't go like this. So in our case, we have a bunch of tech talent throughout the years. It's one of the stronger points of the former socialist system that stayed. So we have a bunch of engineers, IT technicians, programmers, and everything. But they are not business people. They are not salespeople. So they are only focused on building feature-rich products which they think are going to solve a bunch of people's problems without even talking to those people whose problems they're going to solve. So when you have somebody who maybe had 3 or 4 or 5 different startups behind them and did something similar in the room and sharing their experiences, that's invaluable. Actually, I'm just coming in this conference from a workshop that we just had on pricing. So we had some 30 startups. So now it's obviously more a different situation to how it was 5 or 6 years ago. And we have talked about to some 30 startups. One of them is actually from Sweden, which is the weird added value of going online because of COVID. But they need tips and tricks on how to talk to, for example, American customers. In our cases, usually it's US or Central Europe. We have huge diaspora in German-speaking countries, so that's also very interesting. So I'm digressing a little bit, but what is important, which I'll try to have a bit different answer to Sebastian's. What is really important is to also, which is our role, is to talk to these people that come here and not just drop them into the ecosystem, because there needs to be some contextual understanding of the situation. So we are not Silicon Valley, we are not Estonia, and even though people like to compare themselves here and would like to become Silicon Valley or Estonia at some point, we should actually first strive to become a Bulgaria, then maybe we can become Slovenia, and so on. I mean, these are the contexts we are coming from. We want to solve the problems that we have quicker than everybody else did, but we still have some way to go. And obviously, We don't have the conditions that Silicon Valley had. We don't have the government that Estonia had in '96, probably won't have it for a long time. So we have to focus on what is the advantages of our ecosystem. And that's the knowledge of the people, that they have the technical knowledge. In most of the cases, this is not 100% cases, obviously, but it's one of the peculiarities. We have very strong outsourcing, which people are afraid of almost here. It's almost a bad word. But we are now seeing a lot of people which are natural born entrepreneurs coming out of their outsourcing businesses and just learning the job on the job and developing their skills to then go on and develop their own products. And when they want to make that their first step, it's really good to have somebody that already did this before in some other context. But also, just to mention, we also have, obviously being here and working here for as long as we did, we have a huge network of local experts and practitioners, which when we started, the word mentor barely didn't exist. It was connected to academic system, basically. So mentor is somebody that helps you with your PhD or something like this. But right now we have a lot of mentors. Some of them were engaged by us directly. Some of them were engaged by partner organizations. So we usually try to solve people's problems by putting them in, engaging them in the local community. But very often we are now seeing first, or maybe in some cases, second generation of IT entrepreneurs going here. So some of them are turning into mentors, some of them are not, some of them are very selfish, some of them are not paying forward or giving back. So yeah, that's it. I hope I answered the question.
Thanks, Milos. Absolutely. Sean, I'm keen to throw this to you, but there's a thread that I want to try and pull out from what was shared around like culture and mindset and the shift in that, the importance of that shift and how bringing in different perspectives and really focusing on strengths can help to shift the culture and mindset. This reminds me very much of reading the case study of your work. Could you talk a little bit about how that worked in the Property Point initiative?
Yeah, I think one of the key factors for us was really understanding, so from a supply chain perspective, specifically private sector, there is a specific either organizational culture or corporate bias. So, we play a lot in this space, especially when it comes to small and growing businesses, around the unconscious bias element that comes into place around how people view small and growing businesses, how they make decisions, and how supply chains or market access is actually being facilitated due to that. So it was important for us to ensure that we understand where, from a demand side, what was the challenge or how they perceived small businesses. How do we also start lowering those barriers to entry was critical. And then when we're working with small and growing businesses, to ensure that they start going into it from a growth mindset perspective, not looking at corporate and government as an opportunity for a handout of opportunity just because they are a small growing business, but for them to be able to compete effectively in the marketplace, so that they're able to provide quality service, effective costing, and innovation in the supply chain. So our hypothesis was really saying that the inclusion of small and growing businesses that fits both your organizational culture and value proposition will add benefit in your supply chain, from a better ease of doing business or customer service perspective, effective and efficient costing, and also innovation. And we've seen quite a bit of specifically around sustainability and kind of the green economy in the built environment, where small businesses have been able to effectively bring those type of innovations and solutions into the supply chains, which makes it then not a grudge purchase from corporates to work with small and growing businesses, but they actually start seeing the value proposition of working with these businesses, as opposed to larger service providers within the industry. But I think it's about being able to focus on that, almost the what we would refer to as the softer skills, and not necessarily it's the combination of the softer skills and the business skills that provides the element of success for small businesses.
Wonderful, thanks, John. got another question from the audience. This one again for you, Milos. When you say there is no contractual obligation for your partners, does that mean you provide sort of one-off help to entrepreneurs? And if that's the case, how do you account for project or organizational impact? How do you track performance and implementation of activities?
Yes, it means different things. It means that in the last 6 years, we worked with more than 20 different organizations. So some of them that we worked 6 years ago are still here. Some of them don't exist anymore. Some of them we don't work with anymore. So it's, as I mentioned, it's really input based. So they usually come to us when they need something. I mean, it's continuous. It goes on for a long time already. But when I meant contractual obligations, we still have some sort of agreements with them because we have to have a proof that we're actually working with someone. But it's not any kind of commitment of how many workshops they have to have. Do they have to do something with us in some amount of time? It's more of a kind of a memorandum of understanding. But also we don't have it with a lot of organizations. We have to mention here that our main donor is, our only donor is SECO, Swiss Economic Secretariat, which is very flexible with our approach and has a lot of understanding for the kind of industry we are addressing in this case. And how it goes in very, very simple terms, I will use a concrete example. When we started, we were supporting one organization which decided to establish first private fund for investing in startups in Serbia. And obviously they've never done it before. Before that, they were an accelerator. I would even say pre-accelerator, but not to get into those kind of terminological issues. So they were looking for somebody to help them, somebody who already did this. So they had we had a few ideas, they had a few ideas. We decided to bring one person who already did it before. He spent some time with them and actually stayed in touch with them afterwards and helped them build this fund, which actually has been working for the last 4 years. And now they're closing the fund and opening a new one, hopefully soon, which is going to be like 5 times bigger than the last one. So but obviously when they spent the time with the expert, then they went on to do what they were actually planning to do, which is establish the fund. So obviously we didn't hear from them for about a few months. So this is work-wise. Obviously we are all the time in contact with all of the partners and checking if they have some needs or if they need something, if they don't come to us first. So that's what I meant by contractual obligations. And so yes, this is very context specific. I will now, I'm talking usually general about our approach, but I will now, just to make things a bit clearer, use the 2 examples that I have, which is working in Bosnia on one hand and working in Serbia on another hand. It's 2 different ecosystems. So in our case, we have in Belgrade, we have a bit more engaged organizations which are more coming towards us, which in case of Bosnia is a bit different. So obviously we have different level organizations in both of the countries. But in Bosnia, we are working with a lot of organizations which are not very specific in what they do. So not exclusively startups, but they are, for example, implementing 5 or 6 different programs. One of them is targeting startups, other is targeting SMEs, the other is targeting agriculture. So in this case, we are a bit more pushy, so to say. So we have to appear there, have meetings and represent our project more intensively. But obviously, as I said, nothing happens unless they come to us with a concrete demand. And in our case, this demand usually comes when there is a real need, because nobody can get anything else from us except knowledge. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. And we've got a few more coming through. I think, Leah, it'd be great to get your voice in for the next one. The question is, does the panel have any thoughts on how to identify and nurture ecosystems as a whole, in contrast to working with individual businesses or support services? And then what about competition policy, for example?
Great. One way to do that is to scan your entire economy. We've focused and developed a methodology to help decision makers identify the most promising businesses that can tie to economic outcomes. So it really depends on what you're optimizing for. So in this case, if you're optimizing for job creation or increasing GDP, you could look at what businesses have already reached scale, perhaps 20 or more employees or 50 or more employees, and what kind of groups of industries are you seeing being concentrated locally, to see kind of where have companies already found a foothold, and look at when those companies were founded. Were there certain cohorts and waves of sectors developing, and are there perhaps new emerging sectors that can be further nurtured? You may also want to compare how that is in relation to other peer cities or countries to see where you have a competitive advantage. And so that's sort of the macroeconomic approach. I think if you were to follow sort of a bottom-up approach of listening to the founders, you would perhaps identify some of those founders that fit within that category of whatever you're optimizing for. So companies that have scaled, that are creating a lot of jobs in that example, and talk to the founders. What has been easy or really hard for them? And it could be as easy as adding more international flights at the local airport, or helping to speed up some business processes at the local government agency. So kind of what levers can support organizations help push on to just slightly lower barriers that would help the entire ecosystem by listening to just a handful of those that have really been through the most challenge.
I recognize we're fast running out of time. These sessions go far too quickly. There's a couple more questions, but I don't think we'll get to them. So I'd encourage whoever asked them, please reach out to the speakers on the platform and follow up with them. One thing I'd love to do before we end is just recognizing that there are policymakers, there are practitioners, there are funders in the room. What would we offer in terms of practical guidance on ecosystem strengthening, ecosystem stimulating programming? One of the things that bubbles up for me after this conversation is that flexibility is key, and no two ecosystems are the same, and contextualization is critical. But what does that mean? It means assessing, it means listening, and then responding to needs and strengths. This obviously has implications for program design, program implementation, all of the decision making. And that leads to this wonderful framing that you offered, Sebastian, which is that the role is one of facilitation or even orchestration, as opposed to something more directive. But we'd love to hear from the four of you. What sort of one takeaway you have? What's one tip or trick that you would offer for someone looking to either undertake or to fund this work?
I can just quickly answer that. I completely agree with you, Leah. I think the most important stage when we are developing ecosystem is to understand what is happening, and we need to measure and start collecting data and understand how everything moves around, right? So when it comes to, we were having before the panel actually an interesting discussion on this. There is no silver bullet, but you can start to identify something that can help you to start thinking about the ecosystem approach. The first stage should be that measuring, right? Understand where you are stepping up. After that, put the entrepreneurs at the center, talk to him, and try to identify through honest conversations their experiences. And after you understand their experiences based on the data, because the data give you the focus, it's not just an interview just to have lunch with an entrepreneur, with the data you understand what are the experiences that you need to learn from that entrepreneur. And after you have the experiences, it's time to design a program or an incentive or lower barriers or something like that, But at the end, you need to first understand that experience, and based on that experience, design something concrete. And that could be anything, an accelerator, as I said, a foundation. You mentioned also, Leah, putting more international flights. Could be anything. We just need to understand. That's the key element. Understand entrepreneurs based on the evidence that we have.
Yeah. Well, maybe just to concur what Sebastian was saying, because it literally took the words out of my mouth. And we've seen it in a sense that, we've taken a kind of human-centered design approach, which is saying we need to listen to the people that we are trying to solve the problems for, and the entrepreneurs need to be at the center of it. And I think we've seen in different industries or different countries specifically when it comes to policy making, that the voice of the entrepreneur, the voice of the small and growing business is not at the center of those policies, or in terms of how the market is working. So that becomes quite critical in terms of ecosystem stimulation and ecosystem building. But I think it becomes quite critical, the bottom-up approach, as opposed to top-down.
Yeah, exactly. The policymaker or the ecosystem builder need to understand that the stage is for the entrepreneur. They need to put the entrepreneur into the stage to develop all of that. And the key element to make that happen is independency, specifically when you come from the government or even from a private institution. You need to let the entrepreneurs play. And if you're going to have ecosystem builders supporting those entrepreneurs, you need to let them play freely also, so it's all about understanding at the end the dynamics of entrepreneurs and how they move forward.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Milos, Leo?
I can go. I agree completely about the flexibility. Other thing that I would add is keeping the ear on the ground and trying to stay objective about what the conditions are. So, as it was mentioned already a couple of times with the policy-related things, in our case, we for 4 years had zero interest from the government to adapt very old laws to the new industry, which is growing quickly, which is IT industry, and widest as possible. But in the last 2 years, we have been seeing a lot of activity from the policy side. It's a little bit of a boring topic, I know, but now they are jumping in and doing what they think is right. In some things they involve the ecosystem, in some they didn't, but this is very important. It affects a lot of things. So you cannot just continue pretending like there's no government, you just do whatever you want. You have to adapt to these new conditions. Try to help if you can somehow. We had a lot of discussions. And try to act upon what is happening. And I will use another example, which is, I hope, a bit more fun one. We've been reading a lot of literature coming from Silicon Valley and other more developed ecosystems. But what we've been seeing for the last forever, basically, even before the project started, is a lack of angel investors in our ecosystems. But I'm actually talking more specifically about Serbia now. And it was very peculiar because we've been seeing a lot of big exits happening in Serbia for the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of companies being sold for hundreds of millions of euros, but we haven't been seeing really many of $1 million to $5 million, something like this. Either also on a VC level or on Series A level, but also even prior on the angel level. And the answer is very simple. I mean, it took us a while to talk with everybody involved in the process, with the people that actually want to invest as angels, but also startups which are by default investment ready. And the thing is, it's again very contextual. Here, most of the startups bootstrap for ages. And basically, when they build, so this is obviously generalizing, there are specifics about it, but the majority is bootstrapped. And during this process, when they manage to build what they're building, and if they manage to survive, they are now already beyond the seed level of investment or what angels actually can provide them with. But obviously, on the VC level, we have a few VC institutions here, but also their pipeline is limited. And we were curious why it is like that. And then we realized that all these startups that actually grew to a significant level for local conditions, they are earning a lot of money for these local conditions. So maybe from a perspective of an international investor, that's nothing. But in local conditions, they are super comfortable and they can plateau, which is actually a no-no for a Silicon Valley company. And they can continue going like this, providing for their families and the people that work in these companies for ages. And they're not looking for an investment, they're looking for an exit. And this is why the exits happen. Obviously, the situation is changing with new generations. We are now having more startups which are looking to move fast, break things, test something out. If it doesn't work, close it, maybe reach an investment, which is the reason why we now actually do have some angel activity and some other funds which are investing. So that's another example. Thank you.
Thanks, Milos. Sorry, Leah, we'll have to keep this one brief, but any gems?
I'll just add one more point of thinking about self-sustaining ecosystem development over time. So taking the long view of how can you start to elevate the role of entrepreneurs as leaders now, even while the facilitation is still necessary and taking place, but thinking about how can the outside facilitation become less and less over time, because you're celebrating the entrepreneurial successes and behaviors that you are wanting to see. So things like global ambitions and peer-to-peer mentorship start to elevate and celebrate those behaviors now.
That's a wonderful note to finish on. And back to the notion for a moment of play, and play being an important part of this, letting entrepreneurs play. I love that point, Sebastian. So that is us, unfortunately. If you have further questions, please do reach out to the participants in the panel. Thank you so much, Sean, Milos, Leah, Sebastian. This was the last session of BTK for today. So please do join us a little bit earlier tomorrow. I think things are kicking off at 9 a.m. Central European Standard Time. So to continue hearing from some other solutions, other practitioners, please do join us then. In the meantime, the platform remains open for you if you would like to watch recordings or connect with people like the panelists and join other discussions. So with that, see you all tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Take care, folks.